I was standing in a kitchen that wasn't mine, staring at a refrigerator that had no business being part of a family holiday. A white magnet, shaped like a tiny snowman, held a printed screenshot against the stainless steel door. The text was enlarged, blown up until every word felt louder than it should have been. Don't come to Christmas dinner. No greeting, no explanation. Just that sentence, centered like it had been designed to be seen. And beneath it, the sender's name wasn't hidden or cropped or softened in any way. Nancy Caldwell. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine cleaner, the kind people use when they want a place to feel warm even if it isn't. Somewhere down the hall, someone was rearranging chairs. I could hear the scrape of wood on tile, the sound of preparation continuing as if nothing had already gone wrong. But something had. It had gone wrong before the first dish was cooked, before the first guest would arrive, before anyone realized there would be an empty seat that shouldn't be empty. I knew that because I plan weddings for a living. I know what happens when a single detail is removed without telling the people who depend on it. A missing chair is never just a missing chair. It's a question. And questions spread fast in families. Jenny Caldwell was not in that kitchen. Her name, though, was everywhere. On a folded place card I saw later, the ink still fresh, her name crossed out with a single sharp line. Not scribbled, not messy, deliberate, like a decision that had already been justified privately. The card had been slid slightly under a centerpiece of pine branches and red berries, not thrown away. It was still there, half visible, as if daring someone to notice. Michael Caldwell was supposed to be picking up wine. That was the story everyone was telling themselves. He was out, busy, delayed. No one said his wife's name out loud yet. No one asked why she wasn't helping, why she hadn't called, why she hadn't texted anyone in the room. The silence around her absence was thin, stretched tight, like wrapping paper, pulled too hard over a box. I had met Jenny months earlier, when everything was still hopeful and loud and full of lists. She had been calm then, observant in the way women get when they're trying to fit into a family without disturbing its shape. She noticed where people sat, who spoke first, who corrected whom. She didn't challenge things. She adjusted herself around them. That's why, when I saw that message on the fridge, I knew she hadn't stormed out. She hadn't made a scene. She had done exactly what the message told her to do. What no one in that house seemed to understand yet was that obedience can be louder than defiance. Nancy Caldwell moved through the kitchen like a woman hosting a performance. She adjusted napkins that were already straight. She reminded people of times they had already been reminded of. Her voice stayed light, almost cheerful, but her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. Toward the door, toward the places where explanations would eventually be demanded. She didn't remove the printed message. She didn't hide it. She left it there, in plain sight, as if daring reality to challenge her version of events. I didn't ask about it, not yet. In my line of work, you learn when not to interrupt a collapse that hasn't realized it's collapsing. Jenny hadn't told Michael. That much I knew without being told. If she had, the message wouldn't be on that refrigerator. It would have been deleted, denied, retweeted. Instead, it was there, physical and undeniable, waiting for the wrong pair of eyes, waiting for the moment when someone would connect an empty chair to a printed sentence and realize they belonged to the same decision. Families don't explode all at once, they unravel. First, someone notices something missing. Then someone else asks why. Then the person who made the choice starts talking too much, or not enough. Control doesn't disappear quietly. It panics when it's exposed. Christmas dinners are especially unforgiving that way. There are too many witnesses. Too many expectations. Too many traditions that rely on everyone playing their assigned role. When one person doesn't show up, the absence becomes the loudest voice in the room. Standing there, with the hum of the refrigerator behind me and that message pressed flat against cold metal. I could already see how this would end. Not with shouting, not with speeches, but with looks exchanged across the table. with pauses that lasted too long, with a shift so subtle that no one could accuse anyone of causing it, even though everyone would know who did. The chair with Jenny Caldwell's name on it was gone, but the space it left behind was just getting started. I first met Jenny Caldwell in a neutral place, which is always how these stories begin. A hotel lobby with soft lighting, a coffee bar that smelled like burnt espresso, and the kind of background music designed to keep you from noticing how long you've been waiting. She arrived 10 minutes early, not because she was anxious, but because she had learned that being early gives you a tiny amount of control in rooms that don't belong to you. Her hair was pinned neatly, not dramatic, just practical. She wore a coat that looked like it had been chosen for meetings, not dates. And when she smiled, it was polite in the way of someone who has decided not to ask for anything she can't handle being denied. Michael Caldwell came in after her, a little rushed, cheeks pink from the cold, holding 2 cups like he'd been sent on a simple mission and wanted credit for completing it. He kissed her quickly, the way couples do when they're still in the habit of proving something to the world. He sat close enough that his knee touched hers, a quiet gesture that said, "I'm here, we're fine," when they were. Not perfect, not glossy, but real in a way I've come to trust. Jenny asked questions about timelines, about vendor contracts, about how to protect her budget without looking cheap. Michael asked about flowers the way men do when they're trying to participate without getting lost. He mostly listened, but when Jenny looked at him, he nodded like he understood her language. In those early meetings, the wedding itself was the story everyone wanted to tell. A December ceremony, tasteful, winter-themed, without being cliché, a small but elegant guest list. Jenny wanted candlelight. Michael wanted his grandfather's watch, included somehow, a small tradition that mattered to him. The two of them weren't fighting over details. They were building something together. That's what made the first mention of Nancy Caldwell feel like a breeze that sneaks under a door. It wasn't dramatic. Jenny didn't roll her eyes. She didn't lower her voice. She said, very simply, his mom offered to help. She's very involved. That pause before very told me everything I needed. Michael laughed a little, like it was a family joke with a long history. She just likes holidays, he said, and events. She means well, means well. Another phrase I've learned to hear as a warning. Over the next weeks, Nancy's involvement arrived in small packages. An email forwarded to me with Nancy copied, as if she had authority by association. A suggestion about venue parking, a question about seating arrangements, just to make sure everyone is comfortable. Jenny would always write the same thing. My mother-in-law wanted me to ask. At first, it was harmless, even helpful. Nancy knew which relatives refused to sit near which relatives. She knew who didn't eat pork. She knew that Uncle Frank would complain if the music was too loud and still complain if it was too quiet. The kind of knowledge that can save a reception from unnecessary irritation. But there's a difference between knowledge and ownership. Nancy didn't just know things, she marked them. I didn't see it immediately because I'm used to parents being nervous. Weddings turn people into versions of themselves they don't recognize. Mothers of grooms can be particularly strange because they're losing a role they didn't realize was still active. The son becomes a husband. And suddenly, a woman who used to be the center of a household feels herself moved to the edge. Sometimes they adapt, sometimes they tighten their grip. Jenny didn't come to me complaining. She came to me asking for solutions. She asked how to word responses so Nancy would feel included without being in charge. She asked how to redirect conversations without sounding rude. She asked how to keep her own mother from being pulled into Nancy's orbit. She asked if it was normal for a mother-in-law to request copies of contracts. She said it all gently, like she was describing a mild inconvenience. But every time she brought it up, she watched my face, searching for confirmation that she wasn't overreacting. That's something I've seen in brides who are being slowly trained to doubt themselves. Michael, on the other hand, stayed relaxed. He spoke about his mother with affection and fatigue in equal measure. Like a man who has always lived with her intensity and learned to treat it as weather. You don't argue with weather. You just bring a coat. Whenever Nancy's name came up, he would shrug and say she calmed down after the wedding, as if the wedding was the finish line, as if control dissolves once vows are spoken. The rehearsal dinner was the first time I saw them all in one room. That's when dynamics stop being theory and become something physical you can feel in your ribs. Nancy arrived with a wrapped box for the restaurant staff. A display of generosity that made people praise her before they'd even sat down. She greeted the bride's parents like she was welcoming them into her world. She laughed loudly at her own jokes. She asked questions and didn't wait for full answers. Jenny stayed close to Michael, smiling, nodding, letting Nancy's energy flood the table without trying to, damn it. And Michael looked relieved. Like having his mother take over meant he could stop thinking. At one point, Nancy stood up and clinked her glass for attention. Not for a toast, not yet, just to announce that she had arranged a little surprise for the wedding morning. Jenny's face tightened for half a second so fast, most people wouldn't catch it, but I did. I've seen brides flinch at the word surprise, like it's a loud noise near a sleeping baby. After dinner, Jenny found me near the coat rack and asked, very quietly, "Did you know about that?" I told her no, and the way she exhaled made it clear she hadn't been sure I would say that. The wedding itself went beautifully. Not because Nancy behaved, but because Jenny learned how to move around her. She kept her gaze soft. She responded without committing. She smiled through interruptions. She let Nancy feel like she was guiding things, while quietly making sure the actual plan still happened. And in the photos this matters, the photos were perfect. Michael and Jenny beaming. Families arranged, Nancy standing in the front row like she belonged there. Everybody looking like they were part of the same story. Which is exactly what Nancy wanted. After the honeymoon, life should have slowed. That's the part newlyweds looked forward to. Quiet mornings, shared grocery lists, learning each other in the absence of guests and timelines. Jenny told me she was excited for that. She texted me a week after they returned, thanking me again, telling me she finally felt like she could breathe. But breathing doesn't stay easy when someone keeps putting their hand over your mouth and calling it help. By mid-December, Jenny started messaging me again. Not about weddings, about logistics, about holidays, about family gatherings that had nothing to do with me, except that Jenny had learned I was safe. I was an outsider with context. Someone who had watched without taking sides, someone she could tell things to without it becoming family gossip. She wrote, "Nancy is planning Christmas dinner at her house. She keeps asking what I'm bringing like I'm a guest. Then, Michael says it's easier to just go along with it then. Later, I don't think he sees what she's doing." I remember reading that last message and feeling something shift in my stomach, the way it does when you watch someone step closer to a ledge without realizing it's there. Because the holidays are where control becomes tradition, and tradition is the perfect disguise. People will accept things on Christmas that they would question in March. They'll tolerate disrespect and call it family. They'll swallow insults and call it peace. They'll play along because the date on the calendar demands it. Jenny had only been a Caldwell for a short time, but Nancy had been practicing this role for years. She knew exactly how to make her rules feel like the natural order of things. And the closer Christmas got, the more Jenny's messages started to sound like someone trying to solve a puzzle where the picture keeps changing. She wasn't asking how to win. She wasn't even asking how to fight. She was asking how to survive without losing her marriage. Because Michael still thought the problem was small. He still believed his mother's intensity was just love expressed loudly. He still assumed Jenny would always be there beside him, smoothing things over, keeping the peace, adapting. And Jenny had started to wonder what would happen if she didn't. Nancy Caldwell entered Jenny's life the way certain people do, already framed as useful, not intrusive, not controlling, useful. That was the word that followed her everywhere, even when no one said it out loud. "She just wants to help," Michael would say, usually while tying his shoes or scrolling on his phone, his attention split between Jenny and something else. You know how she is. If we don't let her do things, she gets offended. That sentence mattered more than it seemed. Not letting her do things, as if the default state was permission and anything else required justification. At first, Nancy's help came wrapped in politeness. She would call Jenny mid-morning, always at a time that suggested she assumed Jenny was free. She'd ask about grocery plans, about guest counts, about whether Jenny had thought about how tiring Christmas Day could be if people didn't eat early enough. Her voice carried concern, but it also carried assumptions. That Jenny would agree. That Jenny would adapt. Jenny would put the phone on speaker sometimes while we talked, not to complain, just so she could keep her hands free. I'd hear Nancy in the background, explaining how she'd always done things, how the family expected certain dishes, how Michael's cousins had strong opinions about seating and timing and prayer. Every sentence began with context and ended with direction. "Oh, and don't worry," Nancy would add, almost cheerfully. "I'll handle most of it. You just show up. Show up." The phrase landed differently every time. Jenny told me once that she didn't mind being told what to bring. What she minded was being told what mattered. Nancy decided which traditions were non-negotiable, which relatives were prioritized, which plans were flexible, and which were sacred. And somehow, without ever announcing it, she positioned herself as the final authority on what a proper Christmas looked like. Michael didn't see a problem because this was the version of Christmas he had always known. His mother at the center, his father quiet, everyone else orbiting when Jenny questioned small things: why dinner had to be at 4, why Nancy needed to approve desserts, why certain conversations felt off-limits. Michael would shrug. "That's just how she does holidays," he'd say. "It's easier to let her. Easier." Another word that hides cost. Nancy never raised her voice. She never issued ultimatums. She didn't need to be used disappointment the way some people use rules. A sigh here, a pause there, a comment about how things used to be, a reminder of effort already spent. She made resistance feel ungrateful. Jenny tried to contribute ideas gently. She suggested a dish from her own family's traditions, something simple but meaningful to her. Nancy smiled and said, "Oh, that's sweet," in a tone that already meant no. Later, Nancy reassigned Jenny to bread. Bread is safe. Bread doesn't carry identity. I watched this pattern repeat in small, almost invisible ways. Nancy would ask for input, then reframe it. She'd request help, then redirect it. She'd thank Jenny publicly and correct her privately, always with a smile, always with plausible deniability. If anyone asked, Nancy would say she adored her daughter-in-law, and she did, in her way. She adored Jenny's flexibility, Jenny's politeness, Jenny's willingness to bend without breaking the surface. But help, when it's conditional, stops being help. The closer Christmas got, the more Nancy's involvement solidified into structure. She created group chats, she sent schedules, she assigned roles, she spoke about the day as if it were a production she was directing, and everyone else were supporting players. Jenny was included in these plans, but never positioned as essential. When Jenny pushed back softly, carefully Nancy adjusted. She'd apologize quickly, then continue exactly as before. "I didn't mean it like that," she'd say. "I just worry about you. You're still new to all this." New, as if marriage reset adulthood. Michael defended his mother without realizing he was doing it. He interpreted Nancy's behavior through the lens of familiarity, not impact. He heard concern where Jenny felt erasure. And because nothing was openly hostile, because everything was wrapped in tradition and good intentions, he didn't feel urgency. Jenny, meanwhile, began to feel like a guest in her own life. She told me this during a quiet conversation, her voice low, almost embarrassed. "I don't want to make a big deal out of nothing," she said, "but sometimes I feel like I disappear a little when she's around." That sentence stayed with me. Disappear a little. Not vanish. Just fade enough that no one notices when your place is taken. Nancy's version of help depended on one thing: compliance. As long as Jenny adjusted, Nancy stayed warm. As long as Jenny smiled, Nancy praised her. But beneath that warmth was an expectation that hadn't been negotiated, only assumed. Christmas dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a stage. And Nancy had already decided who belonged where. Jenny didn't know it yet, but the role Nancy was carving out for her didn't include equal footing. It included presence without power, participation without agency. And the moment Jenny failed to perform that role correctly, the help would disappear. Or worse, because help, when withdrawn, suddenly leaves a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay quiet. The first territory Nancy Caldwell claimed wasn't emotional, it wasn't verbal, it was practical. That's how she made it invisible. It started with space. Physical space. Her house became the default location for everything that mattered. Sunday lunches, birthday planning, holiday logistics, decisions didn't move through discussion anymore. They moved through addresses. If something was happening, it was happening at Nancy's. Jenny noticed it the first time. She suggested hosting a small pre-Christmas dinner at her own place. Nothing ambitious, just a quiet evening, a way to establish that they were, in fact, a married couple with a home of their own. Nancy's response was immediate and smooth. "Oh, honey, that's so sweet, but my place just makes more sense. I already have everything, and people expect it." Expect that word again. Michael agreed without thinking. He always did when the reasoning sounded efficient. Why complicate things? Why create friction when the system already worked? What he didn't hear was the subtext. Your home is optional, mine is central. Once Nancy's house became the anchor, she began shaping behavior through logistics. Arrival times were announced, not suggested. Seating arrangements were pre-decided. Conversations flowed around her cues. When to eat, when to open gifts, when to sit, when to stand. Jenny found herself adjusting her body language without realizing it. Waiting for signals, watching for approval. She stopped initiating plans and started responding to them. That's what control looks like when it's working. The person being controlled thinks they're choosing ease. Nancy didn't correct Jenny in public. She corrected environments. She'd move an item Jenny placed. She'd reassign a task. She'd forget a suggestion. And when Jenny noticed, it was always too late to address without sounding petty. At one gathering, Jenny brought a dish she was proud of. It wasn't flashy, but it mattered to her. Nancy praised it loudly, then placed it at the far end of the table, away from where people naturally reached. By the end of the meal, most of it remained untouched. "Oh well," Nancy said lightly. "More for later." Later never came. These weren't accidents, they were tests. Small ones. Safe ones. Nancy was checking boundaries the way someone presses on a doorframe, not hard enough to break it, just enough to see if it moves. Jenny felt the movement. She felt it when Nancy began speaking for her. "Jenny doesn't mind," Nancy would say. Or, "Jenny already agreed." Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it wasn't. But once it was said aloud, correcting it felt like making a scene. Michael didn't intervene because he didn't see intervention as necessary. His mother wasn't angry, she wasn't cruel, she was organized, she was generous, she was hosting. From his perspective, nothing bad was happening, but control doesn't announce itself with aggression. It announces itself with convenience. By mid-December, Nancy was managing Christmas like a corporate project. Lists, timelines, delegations, Jenny's role had been quietly narrowed. She was responsible for showing up on time, dressing appropriately, and not disrupting flow. Nancy framed everything as consideration. "I don't want you overwhelmed. You've had such a busy year. Let me take this off your plate." And each time Jenny accepted, something else slipped off that plate too. Authority, presence, ownership. The territory wasn't just Nancy's house anymore. It was the narrative of the family itself. Who mattered, who decided, who adjusted. Jenny tried, once, to reclaim a small piece of it. She asked if dinner could be pushed back 30 minutes so she and Michael could attend something earlier that day. Nancy paused, smiled, then said that would throw everything off. Everything. not just the meal, not just the schedule, everything. Michael looked at Jenny, waiting for her to concede, and she did, because the cost of insisting felt too high in that moment. That was when Nancy learned something important. She learned that Jenny would bend if the structure around her was rigid enough, that she could control outcomes without ever raising her voice, that Michael would default to the version of reality he grew up in. And once someone learns where your limits are, they don't stop there. They redesign the space to make sure you never reach them again. Christmas dinner wasn't approaching quietly, it was being engineered. By the time December settled in for real, nothing Nancy Caldwell did felt new anymore. That was the most dangerous part. Control, once repeated enough, stops feeling like an action and starts feeling like atmosphere. Jenny stopped describing individual incidents to me because there was no longer a single moment to point to. It was a rhythm now, a pattern that replayed itself so smoothly it barely registered unless you were watching for it. Nancy would initiate. Jenny would hesitate. Michael would normalize and life would move on, slightly reshaped. Every phone call followed the same arc. Nancy opened with concern. "I just wanted to check in." Then came the reminder of effort. "I've been coordinating all day." Then the subtle redirection. "So I'll need you to do this." By the end of the call, Jenny had agreed to something she hadn't planned. And Nancy sounded satisfied without ever sounding demanding. Jenny started telling me about it in fragments, not complaints, observations. She always calls when Michael's not around. She phrases things like they're already decided. She talks about me like I'm not in the room, even when I am. None of these statements sounded dramatic on their own. That's why they worked together so well. Each one was small enough to dismiss. Together, they formed a system. Michael remained untouched by it, not because he was cruel or inattentive, but because the pattern benefited him. His holidays were handled. His mother was happy. His wife wasn't openly upset. From his perspective, equilibrium had been achieved. Jenny, meanwhile, was doing constant emotional math, calculating when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to let something go, because the argument wouldn't be worth the aftermath. She began anticipating Nancy's reactions before making decisions, which is how control embeds itself fully. One afternoon, Jenny told me she had rearranged her entire Saturday without realizing it. Nancy had mentioned offhandedly that she might need help preparing something for Christmas. Not asked. Mentioned. Jenny canceled her own plans just in case. She caught herself halfway through the day and laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know why I did that," she said. She didn't even tell me what she needed. That was repetition doing its work. Nancy also began rehearsing narratives. In conversations with extended family, she spoke as if decisions were collective, even when they weren't. "We decided. We thought it would be best. We agreed." Though we never included Jenny in real time, only in hindsight. I saw it during a small gathering when Nancy mentioned a Christmas tradition Jenny had supposedly endorsed. Jenny froze for half a second, then smiled and nodded, because correcting it would require explaining something no one else had noticed yet. And once a lie is wrapped in tradition, it stops sounding like a lie. Michael trusted his mother's version of events because it was confident and familiar. Jenny's discomfort, when she voiced it, sounded uncertain by comparison. She questioned herself even as she spoke. Maybe I'm being sensitive. Maybe it's just the holidays. Nancy never needed to say Jenny was difficult. She let Jenny say it herself. By repeating the pattern, Nancy achieved something crucial. She made resistance feel abnormal. She made compliance feel like peace. And she trained everyone around her to reward silence. Jenny began withdrawing in subtle ways. She stopped offering suggestions. She stopped correcting assumptions. She stopped imagining Christmas as something she participated in, and started imagining it as something she endured. And still, nothing exploded. Nothing cracked. Which made it easier for everyone else to believe that everything was fine. But repetition doesn't stabilize systems like this. It loads them. Each unchallenged moment adds weight. Each swallowed objection tightens the structure. Eventually, something has to give. And when it does, it doesn't break at the point of pressure. It breaks at the point of exhaustion. Jenny was getting close to that point. She hadn't said it out loud yet, but the way she described her days told me enough. She wasn't asking how to fix Nancy anymore. She was asking herself how long she could keep disappearing without being noticed. The expansion didn't happen all at once. It never does. Control doesn't jump, it seeps. Once Nancy Caldwell felt secure in the rhythm she'd established, she began extending it beyond her own house, beyond logistics, beyond holidays. The territory grew quietly, like roots spreading underground. It started with information. Nancy began asking questions that didn't seem related to Christmas at all. She asked about Jenny's work schedule, about upcoming weekends, about whether Jenny and Michael were planning any trips in the new year. Each question was casual, wrapped in curiosity, but together they formed a map. She was learning where she could step next. Jenny answered politely. She always did. She didn't want to seem secretive. She didn't want to suggest there was anything to hide, and so she shared details that later came back rearranged, reframed, or repurposed. When Jenny mentioned a possible weekend away in January, Nancy responded days later with a comment about how hard winter travel could be and how lonely the house felt after the holidays. She never said don't go. She didn't have to. The message landed anyway. Michael noticed none of this. To him, his mother's interest was affection. He didn't hear the weight behind the words. He didn't feel the obligation forming because it wasn't directed at him. Nancy also began expanding into emotional territory, which is harder to name and easier to deny. She'd pull Jenny aside during gatherings and speak softly, almost confidentially. She'd mention how sensitive Michael was, how much change affected him, how important stability was for him right now. It sounded like concern. It functioned like pressure. By framing her control as protection of her son, Nancy positioned herself as an authority on Michael's needs. Jenny, as the new wife, was cast as the variable, the one who needed guidance. I could hear the shift in Jenny's voice when she told me about these conversations. She sounded careful, slower, like she was choosing each word to avoid being misunderstood. She makes it sound like I'm the one who might hurt him without realizing it, Jenny said once. Like I need to be managed. That sentence mattered, because once someone accepts that framing, they start policing themselves. Nancy also began inserting herself into decisions that had nothing to do with family gatherings. She had opinions about finances, about home purchases, about how Jenny and Michael should divide responsibilities. She never gave orders. She offered perspectives. She told stories about what had worked in her marriage. She spoke with the confidence of experience. And experience, when unchallenged, becomes authority. Michael listened to these stories without resistance. They were familiar, comforting. They didn't ask him to change. Jenny listened too, but for different reasons. She listened because disagreeing would require explaining why Nancy's experience didn't apply, and that felt like rejecting her entirely. So the territory expanded again. From holidays to habits. From hosting to lifestyle, from what time dinner was served to how a marriage should function. Jenny started adjusting things she hadn't planned to adjust. She delayed conversations. She softened opinions. She avoided topics she knew would trigger concern. She began filtering herself. That's when I knew the pattern had fully crossed the line from external control to internalized control. Nancy didn't need to be present to influence decisions anymore. Jenny could hear her voice without the phone ringing. The most telling moment came when Jenny canceled something important to her, not because Nancy asked, but because she imagined Nancy's reaction. That's the moment control stops being enforced and starts being maintained by the person under it. Christmas dinner was still ahead of them, looming like a fixed point on the calendar. But the real shift had already happened. Nancy wasn't just hosting a meal anymore. She was shaping expectations, rewriting boundaries, redefining roles. And the more territory she claimed, the more fragile her position became. Because power that depends on silence collapses the moment silence breaks. Jenny felt that instability, even if she couldn't articulate it yet. She felt the pressure building, the narrowing of options, the sense that something had to change before she lost herself completely. She hadn't decided what that change would look like, but she had stopped assuming she would simply endure. Jenny didn't have a dramatic breakdown. There was no moment where she cried on the floor or shouted into a pillow. What she had instead were quieter reactions, the kind that slip past everyone else because they don't interrupt the room. She became tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. She told me this almost apologetically, like fatigue was a personal failure. She'd wake up already bracing herself for the day, running through conversations that hadn't happened yet, rehearsing responses to comments that might come. Her body stayed alert even when nothing was actively wrong. That's usually the first emotional response when someone realizes they're being managed. Hyper-awareness, constant monitoring, the feeling that you're always slightly behind, even when you're doing everything right. Jenny started questioning her own reactions. When Nancy made a comment that felt sharp, Jenny would replay it later, trying to decide if she'd imagined the edge. When Michael brushed something off, she wondered if she was being unfair. She used phrases like, "Maybe I'm overthinking, and it's probably just me," so often that they became reflexes. But emotions don't disappear just because you doubt them. They collect. Jenny grew quieter around Nancy. Not distant, careful. She measured her words. She smiled more than necessary. She laughed at jokes that made her uncomfortable because correcting them felt heavier than carrying the discomfort. Michael noticed the quiet, but he misread it. He thought Jenny was adjusting, settling in, becoming part of the family. He felt relieved by it, which made it harder for Jenny to say anything that would disrupt that relief. When she did try, she chose her moments carefully. Late at night, in their own home. When the day was over and the pressure felt lower, she'd mention feeling sidelined, feeling invisible. Feeling like decisions were being made around her instead of with her. Michael listened, but his responses stayed practical. "She doesn't mean it like that. She's just excited. It's only Christmas. Only Christmas." As if emotions observe calendars. Jenny wasn't angry yet. That's important. Anger still implies energy, direction, a belief that something can be changed. What she felt first was confusion. A dull sense of disorientation, like she'd stepped into a current without realizing how strong it was. She began grieving something she hadn't named. Not her marriage, not even the holidays. She was grieving the version of herself she thought she'd be able to be as a wife. Confident, equal, seen instead. She felt like she was shrinking to fit spaces already defined by someone else. I noticed it when we met for coffee a few weeks before Christmas. She sat differently, leaned forward more, lowered her voice instinctively, even though no one there knew her. Her hand stayed wrapped around her cup long after it had cooled. "She's not doing anything wrong," Jenny said, staring into the coffee. That's what makes it so hard. That sentence carries a lot of weight, because when harm comes without clear wrongdoing, the person feeling it has nowhere to point. No evidence. No accusation that sounds reasonable. Just a body reacting to something the mind is still trying to excuse. Jenny also began to feel resentment, and that scared her more than anything. Not toward Nancy at first, but toward Michael, toward his blindness, toward his comfort, toward the ease with which he moved through situations that left her tense and depleted. She hated that resentment. She buried it. But burying emotions doesn't neutralize them, it preserves them. The closer Christmas got, the more her emotional reactions intensified, even as her outward behavior stayed composed. She felt dread mixed with guilt, anxiety layered with obligation, a growing sense that whatever she did, it would be wrong to someone. That's the emotional trap of this kind of control. You're always disappointing someone, even when you comply. Jenny started fantasizing about absence, not confrontation, not winning, just not being there. The idea floated through her mind quietly, without urgency, without plan. A day without navigating glances. A meal without tension. A room where she didn't have to perform. She didn't act on that thought yet. She didn't tell anyone about it. But once absence becomes a form of relief, something fundamental has already shifted. Christmas dinner was no longer just an event she had to get through. It had become a test of endurance, a point of emotional reckoning she couldn't quite define, but couldn't escape either. She still believed she would show up, that she would manage, that she would survive it the way she had survived everything else. What she didn't know yet was that the decision wouldn't be hers alone, and when it came, it wouldn't sound emotional at all. Nancy Caldwell didn't tighten her grip in private anymore. She didn't need to. By the time Christmas week arrived, she had moved into a phase where control could be spoken aloud and still sound reasonable. That shift only happens when a person believes the room is already on their side. It began with explanations offered before anyone asked for them. Nancy would narrate her decisions in front of others. Not defensively, but confidently, as if transparency itself proved legitimacy. She talked through plans the way managers talk through workflows, assuming agreement because no one interrupted. "Oh, I moved dinner earlier because it's better for everyone," she'd say, smiling around the room. "People get tired later in the evening, and I didn't want anyone overwhelmed." No one argued with that. Who would? It sounded thoughtful, considerate, logical. She framed her authority as protection. Protection of the elderly relatives. Protection of traditions. Protection of Michael most of all. She spoke about him often, even when he was standing right there, describing his needs, his preferences, his stress levels. "He's had such a big year," she told people. "I just want to make things easy for him." Easy became the justification for everything. When someone asked Jenny a question directly, Nancy answered first. Not abruptly, smoothly, like it was natural. Jenny would start to speak, then stop, then nod along as Nancy finished the sentence. From the outside, it looked like agreement. From the inside, it felt like erasure. Michael didn't object because Nancy's version of events always sounded kind, and because she spoke in public, her explanations carried weight. Once something is said confidently in front of others, contradicting it feels disruptive, ungrateful, petty. Nancy also began referencing Jenny's preferences in ways that subtly boxed her in. Jenny doesn't like a lot of attention. Jenny prefers things simple. Jenny said she was fine with this. Each statement positioned Jenny as passive, agreeable, a woman who wouldn't suddenly object because she never had before. And if she did object now, it would look out of character. That's the brilliance of public rationalization. It rewrites someone's identity in real time, in front of witnesses. Jenny felt it happening. She felt her silence being interpreted as consent, her politeness being repurposed as evidence. But every time she considered correcting the narrative, she could already hear how it would sound. Defensive, emotional, inappropriate for the setting. Nancy never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She owned the tempo of the room. When she spoke, conversations adjusted around her. When she paused, people waited. By Christmas Eve, the family had absorbed her version of reality completely. Nancy was the organizer, the caretaker, the woman holding everything together. Jenny was the new addition. Sweet, quiet, lucky. That framing mattered more than anyone realized, because once control is justified publicly, removing it becomes a social disruption, not a personal boundary. Anyone who challenges it risks being seen as the problem. Jenny felt trapped between two identities, the one Nancy had constructed for her and the one she still felt inside. The gap between them was exhausting. She told me, the night before Christmas, that she felt like she was being watched even when no one was looking. Like any deviation from expectation would be noticed, discussed, remembered. "I don't think I can do this again," she said. Not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. She still assumed this meant enduring another holiday, another gathering, another performance. She didn't know yet that something else had already been decided. Because once Nancy rationalized her control out loud, she also revealed something else. She revealed that she believed she could say anything now, and people would accept it. Christmas Day arrived already off balance. I knew it before anyone said anything, before anyone admitted there was a problem. You can feel it in houses like Nancy Caldwell's, when something is missing but no one has named it yet. The air stays busy, louder than necessary. Movements get sharper. People talk around gaps instead of into them. The table was set early. Too early. Plates aligned. Glasses polished. Candles placed with the precision of someone who wanted the room to look unquestionable. There were name cards, though fewer than expected. One space along the long side of the table sat bare. The chair pushed in as if no one had ever been meant to sit there. Jenny Caldwell wasn't there. At first, the family behaved as if this was temporary. Someone checked their phone, someone else glanced at the clock. Nancy kept moving, directing, adjusting napkins, explaining nothing. Michael arrived carrying bags, apologizing for being late. Already halfway into the room, before he noticed the absence, he scanned the table instinctively, the way people do when they're looking for something familiar. "Where's Jenny?" he asked. The question landed softly, but it didn't disappear. Nancy didn't answer right away. She smiled, still arranging something on the counter, and said, "She's probably just running behind." Probably. Another assumption offered as fact. Michael frowned, checked his phone, sent a message. No response. He didn't panic yet. He trusted that things worked the way they usually did, that Jenny would appear slightly apologetic, ready to smooth things over. But time passed. Guests arrived, coats were taken, drinks were poured. The empty chair stayed empty. That's when people started noticing. Not dramatically, quietly. A sister-in-law leaned over and whispered. An aunt paused mid-sentence. Someone asked if Jenny was feeling well. The questions didn't pile up, but they circled. Nancy began filling the space with explanations before anyone demanded them. "She might not be feeling great," she said once. "You know how busy she's been." Michael tried calling again. Still nothing. The room shifted around him, subtle but unmistakable. His mother's voice was steady. Too steady. Dinner was announced. That decision mattered more than it seemed. By serving the meal without Jenny, Nancy transformed absence into fact. Not a delay. Not a concern. A reality everyone now had to sit with. Michael hesitated, standing by the table. "Should we wait a little longer?" Nancy looked at him then, her expression gentle but firm. "It's better not to," she said. "People are hungry." Hungry outweighed absent. As plates were passed, conversations fractured. No one knew where to look. Some avoided Michael's eyes. Others watched Nancy, trying to understand what they were missing. The chair beside Michael stayed conspicuously unused, a visual question no one answered. Halfway through the meal, someone finally said Jenny's name out loud. "She didn't even come." An older cousin asked, confused rather than accusatory. Nancy smiled again. That same practiced warmth. "I told her not to worry about coming this year," she said lightly. "I thought it would be easier." The words hung in the air. Michael's fork stopped mid-motion. "You told her not to come." Nancy turned to him, surprised, as if the idea that he didn't already know was absurd. "Yes," she said. "I didn't want any tension." Tension. The justification slipped out easily, like it had been rehearsed. Michael stared at her, then back at the empty chair. "She didn't tell me." For the first time all day, Nancy hesitated. Not long, just enough. Around the table, people stopped eating. No one spoke. The silence wasn't dramatic, but it was complete. Everyone understood something had just gone wrong, even if they didn't yet know how far it went. Michael reached for his phone again, hands unsteady now. "What exactly did you tell her?" Nancy opened her mouth to answer. And in that moment, before she spoke, before she explained, before she tried to reframe what she had done, the authority she'd been carrying all day shifted. Because control works best when it isn't questioned. And Christmas dinner had just asked its first real question. Nancy Caldwell answered quickly, which was the mistake. People who are truly in control don't rush, they pause. Nancy rushed. I just told her not to come, she said, a small laugh riding the words as if they were She's been overwhelmed lately, and I thought it would be kinder. Michael didn't sit back down. His chair scraped against the floor, loud in a room that had gone too quiet. You told my wife not to come to Christmas dinner, he repeated. Slower this time, testing the sentence as if it might change shape if he said it again. Nancy waved a hand gently, the way people do when they think clarification will fix everything. I didn't mean it like that. I just said she didn't need to feel obligated. Across the table, someone shifted uncomfortably. An aunt set her fork down. Another relative stared at her plate, suddenly very interested in the pattern on the china. No one interrupted, no one defended Nancy. That silence was new. Michael looked around the room, searching for context, for confirmation that this was somehow normal. He didn't find it. Instead, he found faces that were carefully neutral, eyes that avoided his, expressions that said more by saying nothing. You told her not to come, he said again. This time, it wasn't a question. Nancy's smile tightened. I was trying to prevent a scene, she said. You know how emotional things can get. That word landed badly, because everyone at the table knew Jenny. They'd met her at the wedding. They'd seen her navigate conversations with grace, absorb interruptions without complaint, smile through moments that would have rattled anyone else. Emotional was not the word they associated with her. Nancy seemed to realize that too late. She tried to pivot. I just didn't think it was necessary for her to be here if she was uncomfortable. Michael's phone buzzed in his hand. A message. His shoulders dropped slightly as he read it. Then he turned the screen toward the table without saying a word. It was a screenshot. Large text. Simple. Unmistakable. Don't come to Christmas dinner. The room changed instantly. Not with shouting, not with gasps, with stillness. Someone inhaled sharply and didn't exhale right away. Someone else leaned back, creating physical distance from Nancy without consciously deciding to. A cousin glanced at her partner, eyebrows raised, a silent exchange that said, "Did you see that?" Nancy's mouth opened, closed, opened again. That wasn't, she began, then stopped. There was no version of the sentence that improved it. Michael's voice was quiet now, too quiet. You printed it, he said, more to himself than to her. Nancy followed his gaze, finally noticing what others had seen earlier. The absence of Jenny wasn't abstract anymore. It had evidence. It had weight. Around the table, authority drained away from Nancy in real time. People didn't challenge her directly. They didn't need to. They simply stopped orienting themselves around her. Questions shifted toward Michael, not accusations, concern. Is Jenny okay? Where is she now? Did she know everyone was coming? Nancy tried to reinsert herself. I was just thinking about what was best. No one responded. That was the Dorota, not exposure through confrontation, but exposure through irrelevance. Her explanations floated unanswered, landing nowhere. Michael excused himself from the table. Not dramatically. He didn't slam doors. He just stood up and walked out of the room, phone in hand, leaving his mother sitting at the head of a table that no longer belonged to her. Conversation resumed, slowly, cautiously, but it didn't orbit Nancy anymore. It fractured into smaller clusters. People leaned away, voices lowered. Someone suggested clearing plates early. Nancy stayed seated, posture rigid, smile gone. She had revealed too much, too clearly. And now, everyone could see the shape of what Jenny had been living with. No one scolded Nancy. No one needed to. Social power doesn't shatter when it's attacked. It dissolves when it's no longer granted. And Nancy had just lost the room. I didn't see Jenny that night. None of us did. Michael returned to the house alone later, after the table had been cleared. After conversations had thinned out into polite excuses to leave early, he didn't announce himself. He didn't explain. He simply gathered his coat, thanked a few people quietly, and walked out again. Nancy stayed behind. That, more than anything, changed her position forever. In families like this, power lives in association. In being the place people gather. In being the voice they orient around. That night, people stopped doing that. Not loudly, not cruelly. They just didn't look to her anymore. The next few weeks unfolded without confrontation. That was the part many people expected but never got. There were no dramatic apologies delivered in living rooms. No family meeting, no long speech about boundaries. Instead, there were shifts. Invitations stopped defaulting to Nancy's house. Plans were discussed in smaller groups without looping her in automatically. When she offered suggestions, they were acknowledged politely and then ignored. Jenny reappeared slowly, on her own terms. She didn't explain herself publicly. She didn't justify her absence. She let the facts speak for her because they already had. Michael change too. Not overnight, but noticeably. He stopped translating his mother's behavior for others. He stopped smoothing over gaps. He listened more than he explained. Nancy tried, at first, to restore the old order. She reached out, she spoke about misunderstandings and intentions. But something essential had broken. Once people see control clearly, they can't unsee it. And without the room's cooperation, Nancy's authority had nowhere to land. Jenny never confronted her directly. She didn't need to. The silence around Nancy did that work for her. The absence of access. The absence of automatic inclusion. The absence of unquestioned relevance. That was the resolution. Not victory. Not punishment. Just reality. If there's one thing I've learned after years of planning weddings and watching families rearrange themselves around them, it's this. You don't expose control by fighting it. You expose it by stepping out of its way. And when you do, the people who relied on it to feel powerful are left standing alone, explaining themselves to a room that has already moved on.